The moment everything changed, the surveillance footage played on the massive screen in Marcus Wellington's home office. His jaw tightened as he watched the grainy black and white images of a woman moving through the shadows of his son's nursery at 3:47 a.m. There, his head of security, Vincent, said, freezing the frame, "That's the third night this week we've caught her doing this." Marcus leaned forward in his leather chair, his $47 billion empire suddenly feeling meaningless as he stared at the figure of Grace Mbeki, his household maid of only 3 months, standing over his 2-year-old son's crib in the dead of night. "What is she doing?" Marcus whispered, his voice dangerously quiet. "We don't know yet, sir. The camera angle doesn't show everything. But look at this." Vincent fast-forwarded the footage. "She's there for nearly 45 minutes every night. And sir, we found this in her room during a routine security sweep." Vincent placed a small velvet pouch on the desk. Marcus opened it. Inside was his late wife's diamond bracelet, the one that had gone missing 2 weeks ago, the one his wife Catherine had worn on the day she died, giving birth to their son, little Oliver. Marcus felt his heart turn to stone. Get her. Now, 3 months earlier. The Wellington estate sprawled across 47 acres of prime Connecticut real estate. It was the kind of home that appeared in architectural magazines and made even the wealthy feel inadequate. Marcus Wellington had built his empire from nothing, a black man from the south side of Chicago who had revolutionized renewable energy technology and become one of the richest self-made billionaires in American history. But none of that mattered anymore. Catherine was gone. She had been his college sweetheart, his partner through every struggle, every triumph, every late night building their dreams. When his first company failed, she held him. When his second succeeded beyond imagination, she kept him humble. And when she told him she was pregnant, he thought his life was finally perfectly complete. The complications came during delivery. The doctors said words Marcus couldn't process. Emergency, hemorrhaging, impossible choice. Save the mother or save the child. Catherine had made the choice herself. With her last conscious breath. "Save our baby," she had whispered, squeezing Marcus's hand. "Promise me you'll love him enough for both of us." That was 26 months ago. But he won him, placing Muntsing. Marcus had kept his promise about the love, but he had broken in the process. He couldn't look at Oliver without seeing Catherine. Every smile, every giggle, every tiny hand reaching up to him, it all reminded Marcus of what he had lost. So he did what powerful men often do with unbearable pain. He buried himself in work and hired professionals to handle everything else. Nannies came and went. Oliver screamed through the nights. No one could soothe him. No one could reach the little boy who seemed to sense, even in infancy, that something essential was missing from his world. Then Grace Mbeki arrived. The woman from nowhere, Grace had been recommended by a domestic staffing agency after Oliver's 7th nanny resigned in tears, claiming the child was impossible. At 53 years old, Grace was older than the previous candidates. Her resume was simple domestic work for 30 years. References from mid-level families. No fancy credentials. Margaret Sullivan, the estate manager, had almost dismissed the application. Mr. Wellington specifically requested someone with pediatric nursing certifications, Margaret said during the interview, barely glancing up from her tablet. Your qualifications seem rather basic. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing a simple gray dress that had seen better days. Her skin was dark and weathered, lined with years of hard work and harder wisdom. But her eyes, there was something in her eyes that made Margaret pause. A depth, a knowing. "Ma'am," Grace said softly, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of her South African heritage. "I have raised 7 children, 3 of my own who are now doctors and teachers. 4 others I cared for when their mothers could not. I don't have papers that say I can love a child. But I have hands that know how to hold one," Margaret scoffed. This position requires— I know what it requires, Grace interrupted. Still gentle, but suddenly firm. It requires someone who understands that grief lives in little bodies too. Someone who knows that a child who won't sleep isn't being difficult, he's being honest about the hurt inside him. Margaret stared at her. And you think you're that someone? Grace smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. I think every child deserves someone who will try to be. Against her better judgment, and certainly against protocol, Margaret gave Grace a 2-week trial period. She started as a maid, not a nanny, but she would have household access and could observe Oliver to see if she might transition to childcare. That first night, Oliver screamed from 8 p.m. until midnight. The night nanny, a certified infant sleep specialist, sat in a corner, taking notes and occasionally attempting scientifically backed, soothing techniques that made the child scream louder. At 12:15 a.m., Grace appeared in the nursery doorway in her nightgown. "I'll take it from here," she said quietly to the exhausted night nanny. "You get some rest." "I can't do that, ma'am. Mr. Wellington's instructions." "Mr. Wellington's instructions are for his son to be cared for. Let me care for him." Something in Grace's voice made the younger woman step aside. Grace walked to the crib where Oliver stood, tiny fists gripping the rails, face red and wet with tears. She didn't pick him up immediately. Instead, she knelt beside the crib so her eyes were level with his. "I see you, little one," she whispered. "I see that you're hurting. You miss someone you never even got to know, don't you? That's the cruelest kind of missing there is." Oliver's screams softened to whimpers. His wide brown eyes, Catherine's eyes, fixed on this stranger's face. "I lost my mother when I was young too," Grace continued softly. "And for years, no one understood why I cried. They told me to stop being difficult. They told me to be grateful for what I had, but no one ever just sat with me in the dark and said it was okay to be sad." She reached through the bars and let Oliver grip her finger. "So that's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to sit with you in the dark. And whenever you need to cry, we'll cry together. Okay?" Oliver's whimpers faded. His grip on her finger tightened. Grace began to hum a soft, ancient melody from her homeland, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her before the accident that took her. Before the orphanage, before the years of struggle that had shaped her into who she was. 20 minutes later, for the first time in his young life, Oliver slept through the night. The invisible woman Grace officially remained just the maid. Margaret had tried to promote her to nanny, but Marcus had refused without looking up from his laptop. "The agency is sending a new certified candidate next week," he had said dismissively. "The help can continue with the cleaning." The help. Margaret had winced at the term. Grace, standing in the doorway collecting laundry, had shown no reaction at all. But something strange began happening at the Wellington estate. Oliver started sleeping through the night, every night. The certified nannies and specialists took credit, naturally. They adjusted medications, implemented sleep schedules, installed white noise machines that cost more than Grace's monthly salary. Marcus nodded approvingly at their reports, never noticing the dark circles under Grace's eyes. Because every night, after midnight, Grace left her small room in the staff quarters and made her way to Oliver's nursery. She had discovered that the boy would sleep peacefully for hours, but only if someone was there when the nightmares came. Only if someone held his hand through the darkness. So Grace sat in the wooden rocking chair beside his crib, night after night, asking for nothing, telling no one. During the days, she cleaned. She was invisible, the way all domestic workers become invisible to the wealthy, a moving piece of the background, acknowledged only when something was wrong. The windows in the east drawing room still have streaks. The silver needs polishing before the gala. Someone has tracked dirt through the foyer. Honestly, can't the staff do anything properly? Grace bore it all with quiet dignity. She scrubbed and polished and cleaned, and never once mentioned that she held Oliver through his night terrors. Never mentioned that she was the one who had finally gotten him to eat vegetables by turning mealtime into a game. never mentioned that she knew the exact pressure of her hand on his back that would soothe his stomach when he was gassy. The certified professionals took credit for all of it. Grace let them. What she could not let go of was the bracelet. The bracelet. Grace found it on a Tuesday, wedged behind the cushion of the love seat in the nursery. Oliver must have grabbed it during one of his rare visits from his father. Marcus sometimes came to stand awkwardly in the doorway, unable to fully enter the room where his wife had last been alive. The bracelet was exquisite, diamonds and sapphires in a setting that screamed old money and new grief. Grace recognized it from the portrait of Catherine Wellington that hung in the main hall, the beautiful woman with kind eyes who would never see her son grow up. Grace knew she should report the find immediately. That was protocol. That was what an employee did. But Oliver had been holding the bracelet when Grace found it. His tiny fingers had been wrapped around it with a desperate tenderness, as if he somehow understood what it meant, who it belonged to. Grace remembered her own mother's scarf, the only thing she had left of the woman who died when Grace was 4. How the orphanage matron had taken it from her, claiming it was inappropriate for a ward of the state to possess such things. How Grace had cried for weeks, reaching for something that wasn't there. "It's okay, little one," Grace whispered to Oliver, gently extracting the bracelet from his grip. "But this is too precious to lose. Let me keep it safe for you, just until you're old enough to have it properly." She tucked the bracelet into the small velvet pouch she used for her late mother's rosary beads. One of the few things she had managed to reclaim after leaving the orphanage. She intended to tell Margaret about the find after Oliver was asleep. But then Oliver woke with another nightmare, and the certified nanny quit in frustration, and Margaret was consumed with hiring a replacement, and somehow the bracelet remained in Grace's room, forgotten but not lost. Until Vincent found it. The confrontation. The security team came at dawn. Grace was already awake. She had only returned from Oliver's nursery an hour earlier, after another long night of soothing his sleep terrors. She was sitting on her narrow bed, reading her worn Bible, when the door burst open. "Grace and Mbeki, you need to come with us." They didn't let her change. They didn't let her explain. They marched her through the service corridors in her nightgown and robe, past gawking staff members, past the kitchen where she had eaten her meals alone for 3 months. Marcus was waiting in his office. He stood behind his desk like a general preparing for war, his face a mask of cold fury. "Do you know what this is?" He held up the velvet pouch. Grace's heart sank. "Sir, I can explain. This was my wife's." Marcus's voice cracked on the word. "The last thing she wore before she—" He stopped, composed himself. "And we found it in your room, in your possession. Sir, I found the bracelet in the nursery. Oliver had gotten hold of it somehow, and I was going to report it. But, enough." Marcus slammed his hand on the desk. "I trusted you. I let you into my home, around my son, and you repay me by stealing from my dead wife? No, sir, that's not what happened." "Then, explain the surveillance footage." Marcus clicked a button, and the screen behind him lit up with images of Grace in the nursery at night. Image after image of her standing over Oliver's crib in the darkness. "What were you doing there? What were you doing to my son?" Grace went still. She looked at the images herself as a shadowy figure, moving through a dead woman's nursery in the middle of the night. She understood how it looked, how it would always look to someone who couldn't imagine a maid caring that much about a child who wasn't hers. "Sir," she said quietly, "I was caring for Oliver. At 3 a.m., without authorization, sneaking around like someone who loves your son." The words came out stronger than Grace intended. "Like someone who knows that the night terrors he has aren't listed in any of those specialists' reports because they're too proud to admit they can't help him. Like someone who has held that little boy through every nightmare for 3 months because his father is too broken by grief to do it himself." The room went silent. Marcus stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. "What did you say?" "I said what nobody in this house has the courage to say." Grace straightened her spine, suddenly looking less like a maid and more like something else entirely. "Your son is grieving, Mr. Wellington. He's grieving for a mother he never knew, and he's grieving for a father who can't bear to look at him. He screams at night because it's the only time anyone pays attention to his pain. And I have been there, every single night, because I know what it is to be a child that nobody sees." She took a step forward, and for the first time, Marcus noticed something in her, bearing a dignity that transcended her position, a strength that had nothing to do with wealth or status. "I didn't steal your wife's bracelet. I found it in your son's hands because somehow that little boy found the one thing in this entire mansion that belonged to his mother, and he was holding on to it for dear life. I kept it safe because I was going to give it to him one day, when he was old enough to understand. Because every child deserves something of their mothers. Every child deserves proof that they were loved by someone who isn't there anymore." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I have nothing, Mr. Wellington. I have worked my entire life, scrubbing floors, washing dishes, caring for other people's children, and I have nothing but the clothes on my back and a faith that refuses to quit. Why would I risk everything to steal a bracelet I could never sell, could never wear, could never explain? What would be the point?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. "The point," Grace continued, "would only exist if I were the kind of person who would hurt a grieving man and his motherless child. And if you believe that's who I am, after everything I've done for Oliver, then you can call the police right now. But I need you to know one thing first." She walked to the desk and placed her hands flat on the polished wood, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made the billion-dollar man lean back in his chair. "Your son spoke his first full sentence last week. Did anyone tell you that?" He said, "Grace, stay. Because I'm the only one who does." The crack in the armor. Marcus didn't call the police. He sat in his office for 3 hours after Grace was escorted back to her room, not to pack her bags, as everyone expected, but simply to wait. The house hummed with gossip. The staff whispered about the dramatic confrontation. The certified nanny used the chaos as an opportunity to request a raise. But Marcus just sat there, staring at the frozen image of Grace standing over his son's crib. At noon, he did something he hadn't done in months. He went to the nursery. Oliver was in his playpen, surrounded by expensive toys he showed no interest in. When the door opened, his little head turned, and Marcus saw his wife's eyes looking back at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said awkwardly. It's Daddy." Oliver stared at him. Then he looked past Marcus to the door. "Grace?" the little voice asked. "Grace, stay?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Grace, stay." His son's first full sentence, and it wasn't about him. It was about the maid, the help, the invisible woman who had apparently been doing what Marcus could not, loving his child through the darkness. Marcus sank onto the floor beside the playpen. For the first time since Catherine's funeral, he let himself really look at his son. Oliver had her nose, her dimples, her way of tilting his head when he was curious about something. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Oliver or to Catherine or to himself. "I'm so sorry." He reached into the playpen, and Oliver flinched an unfamiliar hand from an unfamiliar face. But Marcus didn't pull back. He waited, his hand extended, his heart breaking at the realization that his own son didn't know his touch. "I'm going to do better," he promised, "starting right now." The investigation. That evening, Marcus called Vincent into his office. "I want you to pull all the nursery footage from the past 3 months. Every night. Every hour. I want to see everything." Vincent frowned. "Sir, we've already established that the maid was entering the nursery without authorization, and I want to know what she was doing there. All of it. Not assumptions. Evidence." It took 4 hours to review the footage. 4 hours of watching Grace and Mbeki do something Marcus had never imagined a stranger would do for his son. He watched her rock Oliver through night terrors, watched her sing lullabies in a language he didn't recognize, watched her change diapers the night nanny had ignored. Warm bottles, the specialists said, weren't necessary. Simply hold the crying child when nothing else would work. He watched 3 months of invisible love play out in grainy black and white. And then he watched the night of the bracelet. The footage showed Oliver, not yet asleep, grabbing something shiny from between the cushions. He must have found it during Marcus's last awkward visit. The baby clutched the bracelet, crying, seemingly sensing its significance. Grace appeared in the frame. She gently extracted the bracelet from Oliver's grip, studied it for a moment, then tucked it safely into her pouch. She could have pocketed it and walked away. Instead, she spent the next hour soothing Oliver, helping him understand that the pretty thing was safe, that it would be there for him when he was ready. Marcus watched her whisper something to the child. The cameras didn't capture audio, but he could read her lips. "Your mama loved you, little one. And one day, you'll have this to prove it." Marcus dropped his head into his hands. "Sir?" Vincent asked hesitantly. "Should I still contact the authorities?" "No." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "I need you to do something else. I need you to find out everything there is to know about Grace Mbeki. Everything." "And Vincent?" "Yes, sir?" "Tell the kitchen to prepare her a proper meal. In the dining room, not the staff quarters." Vincent's eyebrows rose, but he knew better than to question. "Yes, sir." The truth begins. The investigation into Grace's background began the next morning. What Marcus expected to find was a simple story. A poor woman from South Africa who had come to America for a better life, the kind of immigrant success story that corporations like to put in feel-good advertisements. What he found instead was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Grace Mbeki had not come to America for a better life. She had been brought here, trafficked. At 19 years old, with nothing but promises of legitimate work and the dream of escaping the poverty of her township, Grace had been lured onto a plane by people who seemed kind but had darkness in their hearts. She had been sold into domestic servitude, forced to work 18-hour days for families who saw her as property rather than a person. For 8 years, she had been a slave in everything but legal name, until she escaped. Marcus read the reports with growing horror. Grace had fled her captors with nothing, no papers, no money, no place to go. She had lived on the streets. She had been caught and deported. She had returned illegally because there was nothing left for her in a country that had already taken everything, and through it all, she had worked. She had scrubbed and cleaned and cared for children who weren't hers. She had earned every certification the hard way, night classes paid for with blood blister wages, tests taken in a language she had taught herself. She had built a life out of ashes, not once but twice, and she had done it without ever becoming bitter. "There's something else, sir," Vincent said quietly. "Something from last year, before she came to work here." He handed Marcus a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Hero. Woman Saves 3 Children from House Fire." The accompanying photo showed Grace, soot-covered and exhausted, being treated by paramedics while 3 small children clung to her. Marcus read the article. Grace had been walking past a burning apartment building when she heard screaming. Without thinking, she had run inside, into flames, through smoke, against every instinct of self-preservation, and she had carried those children out, one by one. When asked by reporters why she had risked her life for strangers, Grace had said simply, "Every child deserves someone to run toward the fire for them." Marcus set down the clipping. His hands were shaking. "Sir?" Vincent asked. "What would you like me to do?" Marcus stood slowly. He looked at the portrait of Catherine that hung on his office wall, his wife's kind eyes, her gentle smile, her unwavering belief that people were fundamentally good. "Promise me you'll love him enough for both of us." He hadn't kept that promise. He had been so consumed by grief that he had abandoned his own son to the care of strangers, never noticing that one of those strangers had given Oliver something Marcus couldn't: unconditional presence. "I need to apologize," Marcus said quietly, "and I need to find out why a woman who has suffered more than I can imagine chose to spend her nights loving my son." That night, Marcus went to the nursery at midnight. He found Grace already there, sitting in the rocking chair beside Oliver's crib. She wasn't holding the boy, he was sleeping peacefully for once, but her hand rested on the crib rail, close enough that Oliver could reach for her if he needed to. Grace looked up when Marcus entered. She didn't stand. She didn't bow her head. She simply met his gaze with the same quiet dignity she had shown since the moment she walked into his home. "I owe you an apology," Marcus said. "You owe me nothing, sir. I owe you everything." He took a step closer. "I read your file. I know what you've been through. I know what you've survived. And I cannot understand why someone who has every reason to be angry at the world would choose to spend her nights caring for the child of a man who called her the help and accused her of being a thief." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, that same sunrise smile that had caught Margaret's attention 3 months ago. "Mr. Wellington, do you know what the most precious thing in the world is?" Marcus shook his head. "It's the chance to give what you never received." Grace looked at Oliver's sleeping face. "I was a child who no one stayed for. I was a girl who screamed in the dark and woke up alone. I was a woman who ran into fire because I knew what it was like to wish someone had run for me." She turned back to Marcus. "Your son doesn't have to become what I became. He doesn't have to grow up believing he wasn't worth staying for. And if I can give him that gift, the gift of knowing someone will always come when he calls, then everything I suffered was worth it." Marcus felt tears sliding down his face. He hadn't cried since Catherine's funeral. He had thought himself incapable of it. "I'm going to make this right," he said hoarsely. "I don't know how yet, but I promise you." "Don't promise me anything," Grace said gently. "Promise him." She nodded toward Oliver. "Promise your son that tomorrow, when he wakes up, you'll be there. That's the only promise that matters." Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time since Catherine died. "I'll be there," he whispered. "I swear to God, I'll be there." Outside the nursery windows, the first light of dawn began to break through the darkness. But inside the Wellington estate, the real light was just beginning to shine. The stranger at the gate. The black SUV had been parked outside the Wellington estate for 3 days. Security had run the plates stolen. They had photographed the driver, a large man, with a scar across his left cheek, who never seemed to leave the vehicle except to relieve himself in the woods. They had reported the suspicious activity to local police, who promised to look into it. But Marcus Wellington hadn't become a billionaire by waiting for other people to solve his problems. "I want to know who he is," Marcus told Vincent on the 4th morning, "and I want to know today." What Vincent discovered would change everything. It had been 6 weeks since the accusation, 6 weeks since Marcus had watched surveillance footage of Grace loving his son through the darkness, 6 weeks since he had promised to be the father Oliver deserved. He was trying. God. He was trying. Every morning, he woke at dawn to have breakfast with Oliver. Every evening, he came home early, something his board of directors complained about, loudly to read bedtime stories. He learned his son's favorite foods, mashed bananas with a hint of cinnamon, his favorite songs, anything Grace sang, his favorite game peekaboo, behind Daddy's ridiculously expensive curtains, and every night, at midnight, he found himself standing in the nursery doorway, watching Grace rock his son through the dreams that still sometimes turned dark. "You should sleep," Marcus said one night, stepping into the room. "I can take the night shift." Grace smiled her sunrise smile. "Mr. Wellington, I've been doing this for 30 years. My body doesn't remember how to sleep through the night anymore." "Then, at least let me keep you company." It was a strange friendship that developed the billionaire and the maid, sitting together in the dark while a motherless child dreamed. They talked about everything and nothing. Marcus learned that Grace had grown up in a township outside Johannesburg, that her mother had been a seamstress who died in a car accident, that she had spent 10 years in an orphanage before being recruited for work abroad. He learned about the trafficking without Grace telling him directly, she still didn't know that he had read her file. But pieces emerged in her stories. The family who had employed her without pay, the years of sleeping in a closet, the escape through a window at 3 a.m. How did you survive? Marcus asked one night. How did you keep going? Grace looked at Oliver, sleeping peacefully now. You find reasons. Sometimes the reasons are small. A sunrise, a warm meal, a child who smiles at you even though they're not yours. Sometimes the reasons are big: justice, hope, faith. But you keep collecting reasons, and eventually you have enough to get through another day. She turned to look at Marcus with those deep, knowing eyes. What are your reasons, Mr. Wellington? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I'm still collecting them. Grace nodded, as if this was exactly the answer she expected. That's okay. Collecting takes time. The important thing is that you're looking. The investigation into the suspicious vehicle led to a discovery that made Marcus's blood run cold. The man in the SUV was named Eric Voss. He was South African, a former police officer who had been dismissed for corruption, and he now worked as a contractor for a network of wealthy families who used trafficked domestic workers. His specialty was finding escapees and bringing them back. There's more, sir, Vincent said grimly. We tracked his communications. He's been in contact with a family called the Myers New York Money, old establishment. And here's where it gets complicated. Vincent pulled up a photograph. Marcus recognized it instantly. It was from the society pages of a newspaper, a feature on the Wellington Foundation's annual charity gala. In the background of the photo, clearly visible, was Grace. He's been looking for her for 3 years, Vincent said. The Myers claim she stole from them when she escaped over $200,000 in jewelry and cash. They've offered a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery. Marcus felt his hands clench into fists. Recovery? She's a human being, not lost luggage. To them, sir, she's property that walked away, and property that talks about how it was treated. Vincent paused. There's no statute of limitations on what they're accusing her of. If Voss takes her, she'll be arrested, tried, and almost certainly convicted. The Myers have the kind of lawyers that don't lose. Marcus stared at the photograph. Grace, in the background, serving drinks at his gala. Invisible, unprotected, vulnerable. What do we know about the theft accusation? Vincent handed him another file. We know it's fabricated. The stolen items were Grace's own possessions, things she bought with the small allowance the Myers gave her over 8 years. They're claiming those items were gifts that she had no right to keep. Can we prove that? With the right lawyers, maybe. But sir, Vincent hesitated. This isn't just about Grace. The Myers are connected. Old money, political influence, the kind of people who don't like their secrets being exposed. If you go to war with them, it won't just be a legal battle. They'll come after Wellington Industries. They'll come after you. Marcus sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about Catherine, about how she would have handled this situation. She had always been the conscience of their partnership, the one who reminded him that money was a tool, not a shield. The measure of a person isn't how much they have, she used to say. It's what they're willing to give up for what's right. What was he willing to give up? Everything, he realized. He was willing to give up everything. Prepare our legal team, Marcus said quietly. And Vincent? I want to know everything about Grace's past. Every person who hurt her, every system that failed her, every injustice she suffered. I want it all documented. Sir, if I may ask why? Marcus stood and walked to the window. Outside, the SUV was still there, a dark presence waiting at the edge of his perfect world. Because I'm going to burn it all down, he said, and I'm going to build something better in its place. Marcus found Grace in the garden that afternoon. She was pruning roses, a task that wasn't technically her job, but one she seemed to enjoy. Her hands moved with practiced grace, removing dead blooms to make room for new growth. Can we talk? Marcus asked. Grace looked up, her expression guarded. In the weeks since the accusation, their relationship had shifted from employer-employee to something harder to define. But trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Of course, sir. Please don't call me that. Marcus sat down on a nearby bench. I think we've moved past formalities. Don't you? Grace hesitated, then sat beside him. What did you want to talk about? Marcus was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. I know about the Myers. Grace went very still. I know about Eric Voss, the man in the SUV. I know about the trafficking, the escape, the false accusations they've made against you. I know everything, Grace. She didn't speak. Her hands, which had been folded in her lap. Marcus continued. That you brought danger into my home, near my son, without warning me. But I understand why you couldn't. Why would you trust anyone, after what you've been through? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. I never meant to put Oliver at risk. I know. Marcus reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. I know, Grace. And I need you to listen to me carefully. You are not going back to them. Not ever. I'm going to protect you. Grace looked at him, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Wellington, Marcus, you don't understand. The Myers are powerful. They have lawyers, connections, people who specialize in making problems disappear. If you try to fight them, they'll destroy you. Let them try. You don't know what they're capable of, and they don't know what I'm capable of. Marcus squeezed her hand. I have $47 billion. Grace. I have lawyers in every country, contacts in every government, influence in every industry that matters. But more importantly, I have something they don't, a reason to fight. What reason? Marcus thought about Oliver, about Catherine's last words, about the woman sitting beside him who had taught him that love could survive unimaginable suffering. I have you, he said simply. And I have a son who needs you. And I am not going to let anyone take either of those things away from me. Grace stared at him, something shifting in her expression. Why? She asked. After everything, the accusations, the suspicion, why would you fight for me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Do you know why I fell in love with my wife? Grace shook her head. Because she was the first person who ever believed I was worth loving. I came from nothing, Grace. The South Side of Chicago, a single mother working 3 jobs, a neighborhood where people didn't expect you to survive, let alone succeed. And Catherine looked at me and saw something everyone else missed. He turned to face Grace directly. You did the same thing for Oliver. You looked at a screaming, hurting child and saw someone worth staying for. You gave him what Catherine gave me, the belief that he mattered. How could I not fight for someone who did that? That night, Grace told Marcus the full story. They sat in the library, the fire crackling softly, while she spoke about things she had never told another living soul. The Myers had purchased her from her traffickers for $15,000. They had dressed her in a maid's uniform, given her a small room in the basement, and put her to work serving their every need. For 8 years, she had cooked, cleaned, cared for their children, and been treated as something less than human. She had no days off, no salary beyond a small allowance that Mrs. Myers would sometimes withhold as punishment for perceived infractions. She was not allowed to leave the property without supervision. She was not allowed to speak unless spoken to. She was not allowed to look her employers in the eye. The Meyer children were particularly cruel. They had been raised to see Grace as furniture that could follow orders, and they treated her accordingly. They threw food at her, left deliberate messes for her to clean, and once, in an incident that still gave Grace nightmares, locked her in the basement freezer as a joke. But the worst part, Grace said, was the erasure. They didn't just take my freedom, she explained, her voice steady despite the tears. They took my history, They made me pretend I didn't exist before I came to them. They took my mother's photograph, the only one I had, and burned it in front of me. They said I belonged to them now, and the person I was before didn't matter anymore. Marcus felt a rage building in his chest, a cold, controlled fury that demanded action. "What happened?" he asked. "What made you finally escape?" Grace was quiet for a long moment. Their youngest son was born, Thomas. A beautiful baby boy who cried all the time because his mother was too busy with her social engagements to care for him. "I was assigned to be his primary caregiver." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I loved that child, Marcus. I know I shouldn't have. He was their son, part of the family that had enslaved me, but I couldn't help it. He was innocent. He just wanted to be held, to be loved, to know he mattered. So I gave him that." "What happened to him?" "He grew up." Grace's voice hardened. "And his parents made sure he learned their values. By the time he was 8, he was calling me the help and threatening to have me punished if I didn't do what he wanted. They took the baby I loved and turned him into a monster, just like them." She wiped her eyes. "That's when I knew I had to leave. Not just for myself, but for my soul. Because if I stayed much longer, I was afraid I would start to believe what they said about me. I was afraid I would forget that I was ever a person at all." Marcus reached out and took her hand again. "You are a person, Grace. You always were. And I'm going to make sure the whole world knows it." The next morning, Marcus activated what his board of directors would later call the most aggressive legal and PR campaign in corporate history. He hired the best law firm in the country, Goldman, Wright and Associates, and gave them a simple mission: destroy the false charges against Grace and Mbeki and expose the Myers for what they really were. He contacted journalists at the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every major news network. He provided them with documented evidence of human trafficking, labor exploitation, and criminal conspiracy. He used his political connections to push for an investigation into the Myers' business practices, which turned out to be riddled with fraud and corruption. And he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He went public. In a press conference that made international headlines, Marcus Wellington, one of the richest men in America, stood before a bank of cameras and told Grace's story. "This woman," he said, holding up a photograph of Grace, "is a hero. She survived unimaginable suffering, escaped her captors, built a new life from nothing, and still found the capacity to love a motherless child who wasn't hers. She is the best of what humanity can be." He paused, his eyes blazing. "And there are people in this country who want to send her back to slavery. People who think their money and their connections make them untouchable. People who believe they can treat human beings as property." Marcus looked directly into the camera. "They're wrong. I am putting every resource I have into protecting Grace and Mbeki and bringing her abusers to justice. And I am calling on everyone who believes in human dignity to stand with me." The response was overwhelming. Within hours, Numbered Justice for Grace was trending worldwide. Donations poured into a newly created legal defense fund. Protesters gathered outside the Myers' Manhattan townhouse. Politicians who had once been allies of the Meyer family suddenly discovered urgent scheduling conflicts. But the Myers did not surrender quietly. 3 days after Marcus's press conference, Grace received a package. It was left at the main gate, addressed to her by her full South African name, a name she hadn't used in 30 years. Inside was a photograph. The photograph showed 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, ranging in age from about 15 to 20. They were standing in front of a modest house in what looked like a South African township. They were smiling. There was no note, but Grace knew instantly what the message meant. "These are my children," she told Marcus, her voice shaking. "My biological children. I had to leave them behind when I was trafficked. My sister was supposed to raise them, but I lost contact with her years ago. I thought they might be dead." She looked up at Marcus, terror in her eyes. "The Myers found them. They're going to hurt my children, to punish me for exposing them. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Where are they? I don't know. I don't even know their names anymore. My sister would have given them new identities for protection. Grace was crying now, her composure finally cracking. I've spent 30 years trying to find them, Marcus. I've spent every penny I've ever saved on private investigators and search services. And now the people who enslaved me are using them as weapons against me. Marcus pulled out his phone. Vincent, I need our South African contacts activated immediately. We're looking for 3 people children of Grace Mbeki, raised by her sister. I want them found and protected within 24 hours. He turned back to Grace. I promised you I would protect you. That protection extends to everyone you love. You don't understand. Grace's voice was barely a whisper. The Myers don't make threats. They make examples. If they've found my children, they've already. No. Marcus cut her off. No. We're going to find them. We're going to save them. And then, we're going to make the Myers pay for every ounce of suffering they've caused. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Marcus's team worked around the clock, leveraging connections in South Africa's government, law enforcement, and business communities. They traced Grace's sister to a small town called Stellenbosch, only to discover she had passed away 5 years earlier. But the children adults now were alive. Thandi, 28, was a nurse at a clinic in Cape Town. She had married young, had 2 children of her own, and spent her free time volunteering with trafficking survivors. Saifo, 25, had just finished his medical residency and was about to start his career as a surgeon. Nomsa, 22, was in her final year of law school, specializing in human rights. They're incredible, Vincent reported. All 3 of them. They grew up in poverty, lost their aunt when they were teenagers, and somehow still built remarkable lives. Marcus watched Grace as she heard this news. The emotions that crossed her face, pride, grief, hope, fear, were almost too intense to witness. Do they know about me? She asked quietly. Their aunt told them you died in an accident abroad. She thought it would be easier than explaining the truth. Grace closed her eyes. So they've spent their whole lives believing their mother abandoned them and then died. Not abandoned, Marcus said gently. Protected. Their aunt knew that if the Myers ever discovered they existed, they would be used as leverage. She gave them new names, a new story, a chance at a life without your shadows hanging over them. But now the Myers know. Now the Myers know. And that's why we need to move fast. Marcus chartered a private plane and flew Grace's children to America under armed guard. The reunion took place in the Wellington Estate's Grand Foyer, a space designed to impress dignitaries and intimidate business rivals, now transformed into something infinitely more precious. Grace stood at the center of the room, wearing a simple dress that she had insisted on buying with her own money. Her hands were shaking. The doors opened, and 3 young adults walked in. For a long moment, no one spoke. Thandi, Sifo, and Nomsa stared at the woman who had given them life, the mother they had never known, the ghost they had mourned for 3 decades. I know, Grace began, her voice breaking, that nothing I can say will make up for all the years I wasn't there. I know you have every right to hate me, to be angry, to want nothing to do with me. But I need you to know. She couldn't finish. The tears overwhelmed her. It was Thandi who moved first, the eldest, the nurse, the one who had inherited her mother's gift for nurturing. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and wrapped her arms around Grace. We know, Mama, Thandi whispered. We know everything. And we don't hate you. We never could. Saifo and Nomsa joined the embrace. The 4 of them stood there, holding each other, crying, making up for 30 years of lost time in a single moment. Marcus watched from the doorway, his own eyes wet. Behind him, Oliver toddled up and grabbed his father's leg. Daddy sad? Oliver asked. Marcus picked up his son and kissed his forehead. No, Buddy, Daddy's not sad. Daddy's watching something beautiful happen. Later that evening, after the reunion had settled into quiet conversation and shared tears, Namsa the law student pulled Marcus aside. "Mr. Wellington, I need to tell you something about my mother." Marcus nodded. "Of course." Namsa glanced at Grace, who was deep in conversation with Thandi and Sifo, catching up on decades of missed life. "Our aunt left us some documents when she died. Letters, photographs, things she had saved from before the trafficking. We've been researching our family history ever since." "And?" Namsa took a deep breath. "My mother's family wasn't poor, Mr. Wellington. Before the apartheid government seized their land, the Mbekis were one of the wealthiest black families in South Africa. They owned diamond mines, cattle ranches, properties across 3 provinces. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. What happened? The usual story. The government decided their land was needed for development. My grandfather was killed, resisting the seizure. My grandmother died of grief a year later. My mother was sent to an orphanage, and everything the family owned was stolen." Namsa handed Marcus a folder. Inside were documents, old deeds, bank records, photographs of a grand estate that had clearly been someone's home. According to these records, the Mbeki family assets were never legally transferred. They were simply taken. Under current South African law, my mother has a valid claim to everything that was stolen. Marcus stared at the documents. "How much are we talking about?" Namsa smiled a smile that had her mother's warmth and something else entirely her own. "Including the diamond mines, the land, and 70 years of compound interest, conservative estimates put it at around $400 million. Marcus looked at Grace, the woman he had called the help, the woman he had accused of theft, the woman who had spent her life as a servant while an empire waited for her to reclaim it. "Does she know?" "We were planning to tell her tonight. But we wanted to ask you first, as someone who clearly cares about her, how you think she'll react." Marcus watched Grace, laughing with her children, her face transformed by joy after decades of sorrow. "I think," he said slowly, "that she'll say it doesn't matter. And she'll mean it. Because Grace has never cared about money or status or power. She cares about people. That's what makes her extraordinary." Namsa nodded. "That's what we thought too, but she deserves to know. She deserves to understand that she was never the poor, powerless woman the world made her believe she was." "No," Marcus agreed. "She wasn't. She was always a queen. She just forgot." That night, as the Wellington estate settled into an exhausted peace, Marcus found Grace in the nursery one final time. Oliver was asleep, peaceful, his tiny hand reaching out toward the rocking chair where Grace had spent so many nights. "Your children told you," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question." Grace nodded slowly. "They told me about the land, the mines, the fortune that was supposed to be my birthright. How do you feel?" Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, that same sunrise smile that had changed everything. "I feel exactly the same as I did this morning. Grateful, tired, a little overwhelmed." She looked at Marcus. "The money doesn't change who I am. It doesn't erase what I suffered or restore what I lost. It's just paper. Numbers in a bank account. Most people wouldn't see it that way. I'm not most people." Grace stood and walked to the window. "I spent 30 years learning that the things that really matter can't be bought. Love, dignity, the chance to make a difference in someone's life. Oliver taught me that. Or rather, teaching Oliver reminded me." She turned back to Marcus. "I don't need a fortune, Marcus. I never did. What I need is what I found here, a family. People who see me as a person, not a servant. A child who needs me, and a father who's learning to need him." Marcus felt his heart constrict. "Grace, I know." Her smile turned knowing. "I know you've started to feel something for me. I've seen it in the way you look at me, the way you fight for me, the way you sit with me in the dark watching your sons sleep. And I feel it too." Grace walked toward him slowly. "But I need you to understand something. If anything happens between us, It can't be because you feel guilty about how you treated me. It can't be because you're trying to make up for the accusation or the distrust. It has to be because you really see me, and choose me anyway. Marcus met her eyes. I see you, Grace. I see the woman who walked into fire to save children she'd never met. I see the mother who survived hell to find her way back to her family. I see the soul who taught my son how to love and taught me how to hope again. He took her hands in his. I'm not choosing you, despite what you've been through. I'm choosing you because of who you've become. Because you are the most extraordinary person I've ever known. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but this time, they were tears of joy. Then we'll take this slow, she said softly. We'll build something real. For Oliver, for my children, for each other. For each other, Marcus agreed. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break over the Wellington estate. But the true dawn, the awakening of hearts too long in darkness, had already begun. The federal courthouse in Manhattan had seen its share of high-profile cases. Mob bosses, celebrity scandals, corporate executives brought low by their own greed. But nothing had prepared it for the spectacle that was about to unfold. Outside, protesters filled the streets, thousands of people holding signs with Grace's face, chanting demands for justice. News trucks from every major network lined the block. Social media was exploding with the hashtag number Grace Triumphant. Inside, Grace Mbeki walked through the metal detectors with her head held high. She was no longer wearing a maid's uniform. She was wearing a custom-designed suit that had been a gift from her daughter Namsa, a deep purple, the color of royalty, perfectly tailored to remind everyone who saw her that she was not a victim. She was a survivor, a mother, a woman who had refused to be broken. Beside her walked Marcus Wellington, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. Behind them came an army of lawyers, investigators, and supporters, including Grace's 3 children, Oliver in his father's arms, and a surprise guest whose presence would change everything. The Myers were already seated at the defendant's table. Richard Meyer, 72, patriarch of the family, looked diminished, somehow smaller than his reputation, older than his years. His wife, Eleanor, sat rigidly beside him, her face a mask of contempt. Their children, Thomas, now a 30-year-old man with his father's cruelty in his eyes, rounded out the display of inherited arrogance. The judge entered, the room rose, and the final battle for Grace Mbeki's soul began. The prosecution. The case had grown far beyond Grace's individual story. What had started as a defamation lawsuit against the Myers for their false accusations had expanded into a federal human trafficking prosecution. Investigators had discovered that Grace was not the only person the family had enslaved over the past 40 years. More than 20 domestic workers had passed through the Meyer household under similar conditions. Some had escaped, like Grace. Some had been deported when they became inconvenient. 2 had disappeared entirely, their fates unknown, their stories silenced. The federal prosecutor, a formidable woman named Sarah Chen, laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Bank records showing payments to trafficking networks. Immigration documents that had been forged or destroyed. Testimony from other survivors who had finally found the courage to speak. Medical records documenting injuries consistent with physical abuse. And Grace's own story, 30 years of receipts, photographs, and memories that painted an undeniable picture of systematic exploitation. But the most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source, Thomas Meyer himself. The betrayal. 6 months before the trial, Marcus's investigators had approached Thomas Meyer with a proposition. They had evidence, incontrovertible evidence, that Thomas had been embezzling from the family business for years. They had documentation of his gambling debts, his fraudulent expense reports, his secret overseas accounts. If this information became public, Thomas would face his own criminal charges and lose any claim to the family fortune. Or he could cooperate. Thomas, it turned out, was not nearly as loyal to his parents as he pretended to be. Years of emotional abuse had left him bitter and resentful, even as he participated in the same cruelty toward others. When faced with the choice between family and self-preservation, he chose himself without hesitation. His testimony was explosive. My parents purchased Grace Mbeki from a trafficking ring in 1994, Thomas said from the witness stand, not meeting his father's furious gaze. I was 8 years old when she arrived. I remember thinking she was the nicest person I'd ever met. And how did your parents treat her? Like property, like furniture that could follow orders. My mother made her sleep in the basement because she didn't want the help using the same spaces as family. My father. Thomas paused, swallowing hard. My father told me that people like Grace weren't really people at all. He said they were born to serve, and it was our duty to make sure they understood their place. Did you believe him? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. For a while. It's easy to believe terrible things when everyone around you is saying them. But Grace, she was kind to me even when I was cruel to her. She sang to me when I had nightmares. She made me feel safe. His voice cracked, and I repaid her by calling her names and threatening to have her punished. I became exactly what my parents raised me, to be a monster who couldn't see the humanity in someone who had only ever shown me love. The courtroom was silent. Grace, sitting in the gallery, felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She had not expected this. She had not expected to feel compassion for the boy who had helped torment her. But that was the thing about Grace, she had never lost her capacity for forgiveness. Even now, the defense crumbles. The Myers' defense strategy was simple. Deny everything, attack the accusers, and rely on their wealth and connections to muddy the waters. It failed spectacularly. Their lawyers tried to paint Grace as a willing participant who had signed employment contracts and could have left at any time. Prosecutor Chen produced the contracts in question documents Grace had been forced to sign in a language she didn't understand, with terms that made her status as a prisoner crystal clear. They tried to suggest that Grace's children were lying to support their mother's false claims. Namsa, the law student, demolished this argument with testimony that included her own independent research into her family's stolen fortune. Research that revealed the Myers had actually profited from the apartheid government's seizure of Mbeki lands. Your clients didn't just purchase my mother from traffickers, Namsa said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. They benefited from the same system that destroyed my family generations earlier. This isn't just about one woman's suffering, it's about a pattern of exploitation that spans continents and centuries. The Myers lawyers tried to question Marcus Wellington's motives, suggesting that he was only involved because of a romantic relationship with Grace, that his testimony was biased and unreliable. Marcus's response made headlines around the world. You're right that I care for Grace Mbeki, he said from the witness stand. You're right that my feelings for her influenced my decision to get involved in this case. But let me be very clear about something. I didn't fall in love with a maid. I fell in love with a queen. He turned to look at Grace directly. Grace Mbeki has more dignity in her little finger than everyone at that defense table combined. She survived things that would have destroyed most people, and she came out of it with her heart intact. She taught my son how to love, and taught me how to live again. And if caring about someone like that makes me biased, then I'm proud to be biased. The defense had no follow-up questions. The final day of trial brought the revelation that no one, not even Marcus, had anticipated. Grace had asked to make a statement before the verdict. The judge, clearly moved by everything she had witnessed, agreed. Grace walked to the podium slowly, her purple suit catching the light. She looked out at the packed courtroom, the reporters, the supporters, the Myers with their expensive lawyers and expensive expressions of contempt. And then she began to speak. I want to tell you a story, she said. It's a story about a little girl in South Africa who lost everything. Her parents, her home, her name, and was told that she was worthless. That little girl believed what she was told. She spent years trying to be invisible, trying to take up as little space as possible, trying to survive by making herself small. Grace's voice grew stronger. When I was trafficked to America, I thought it was the end of my story. I thought I would die in that basement, forgotten by a world that had never really seen me. But something kept me going. Something inside me refused to accept that this was all I was meant to be. She looked at her children, Thandi, Sifo, Nomsa, sitting in the gallery, with tears streaming down their faces. I survived for them. For children I wasn't sure I would ever see again. I survived because a mother's love doesn't stop just because the world tries to crush it. Grace turned to face the Myers directly. I don't hate you. I should. You took 30 years of my life. You tried to steal my humanity. You did everything you could to make me believe I was nothing. But hate is a prison, and I have spent enough time in prisons already. Her voice softened. What I feel for you is pity. Because you had everything. Money, power, privilege. And you chose to use it for cruelty. You could have been a force for good in this world, and instead, you became slavers. You could have loved, and instead, you only knew how to control. She shook her head sadly. That is the real tragedy of this story. Not what happened to me. I survived. I found my children. I found love. I found purpose. The tragedy is what happened to you. You had every advantage, and you became monsters. Grace paused, gathering herself for what she was about to say next. But I didn't ask to speak today just to forgive you. I asked to speak because there's something the court needs to know. Something that changes everything. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded document. 3 months ago, I received the results of a DNA test. I took this test because I wanted to understand my family history, to see if I could trace my roots back to the ancestors whose land was stolen. What I discovered was unexpected. She unfolded the document and handed it to the judge. I am not just Grace Mbeki, daughter of miners and farmers. I am Grace Mbeki, direct descendant of Chief Moshu Shu's advisor, whose family's lands were taken not once but twice, once by the apartheid government and once by American business interests in the 1,980 seconds. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The American business interests, Grace continued, were represented by a young lawyer named Richard Meyer, who facilitated the illegal transfer of mineral rights from my family's estate to a consortium that included his own family's holdings. The murmur became a roar. Richard Meyer went pale. The Meyer fortune, the wealth that allowed them to purchase me and 20 other human beings, was built on the theft of my family's inheritance. They didn't just enslave me. They enslaved me with money that was rightfully mine. The verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Richard and Eleanor Meyer were convicted of human trafficking, labor exploitation, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Thomas, who had cooperated fully, received a reduced sentence that would allow him to serve his time doing community service with trafficking survivors. The financial penalties were staggering. The Meyer family fortune, including the assets built on stolen Mbeki land, was seized and placed in trust. A significant portion would go to Grace and her children. The rest would fund a new foundation dedicated to combating human trafficking worldwide. The Meyers were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, their faces a study in disbelief. Richard, who had built his entire identity on being untouchable, looked like a man who had just watched his whole world collapse. Because he had. The aftermath. In the months that followed, Grace Mbeki became a symbol of hope for survivors everywhere. She used her portion of the Meyer fortune not to live in luxury, but to build. She established the Mbeki Foundation, which provided legal support, job training, and housing for trafficking survivors. She created a scholarship fund for the children of domestic workers. She partnered with Marcus's company to develop a program that traced exploitative labor practices in supply chains and held corporations accountable. Her children thrived. Thandi expanded her nursing clinic to serve trafficking survivors specifically. Sifo pioneered new techniques for treating trauma-related health conditions. Nomsa graduated at the top of her class and immediately went to work for the foundation her mother had created. And Oliver, little Oliver, who had started it all by clutching his mother's bracelet in the dark, grew into a child who knew he was loved. He called Grace Gigi, a name of his own invention, and followed her everywhere she went. She continued to rock him through his occasional nightmares, and he continued to sleep peacefully, knowing she was near. "You know," Marcus said one evening, as they sat on the terrace watching the sunset, "I've been thinking about something." Grace smiled. "That sounds dangerous. I've been thinking about what you said in court. About how hate is a prison. And you've spent enough time in prisons." And, Marcus turned to face her, "I've spent most of my life in a different kind of prison. The prison of achievement. Of always needing to prove I was worthy of success, worthy of respect, worthy of love. Even with Catherine, part of me was always waiting for her to realize I wasn't enough." He took Grace's hand. "But with you, I don't feel that way. You've seen me at my worst, suspicious, accusatory, so lost in grief I couldn't love my own son. And you stayed anyway. You saw past all of it to something I didn't even know was there." "Everyone has something worth seeing," Grace said softly. "Most people just need someone to look hard enough to find it." "That's what I want to do," Marcus said. "I want to spend the rest of my life looking at you, really looking and making sure you know every day how extraordinary you are." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I had this made from a stone from your family's mine, from the land that should have been your birthright. It's not about the money or the history. It's about bringing things full circle, about building something new from what was stolen." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a single perfect diamond, set in a band of braided gold and silver. "Grace Mbeki, will you marry me?" Grace looked at the ring. She looked at Marcus. She looked at the estate where she had once been the help, and was now something else entirely. "Yes," she said. "On one condition." "Anything. We keep the nursery exactly the way it is. That rocking chair stays. Because that's where our story really began in the dark, with a crying child who just needed someone to stay." Marcus laughed, tears in his eyes. "Deal." The wedding? They married 6 months later, in a ceremony that combined South African traditions with American elegance. Grace walked down the aisle in white, but her dress was embroidered with patterns from her homeland, symbols of strength, resilience, and maternal love. Her children walked beside her, Thandi as her maid of honor, Sifo and Namsa as attendants. Oliver served as ring-bearer, toddling down the aisle with his Gigi's diamond bracelet, Catherine's bracelet tied to a pillow. The guest list included everyone who had been part of Grace's journey. The night nanny who had first let Grace into the nursery, Margaret Sullivan, who had taken a chance on an older applicant with no fancy credentials, the journalists who had told Grace's story, the survivors whose lives had been changed by her foundation. Even Thomas Meyer sent a letter, not an invitation, but an apology, a real apology, written from the community service center where he was working to make amends. Grace read it and wept, then wrote back with 3 words, "I forgive you." The reception was held on the grounds of the Mbeki ancestral estate in South Africa, land that had finally been returned to its rightful owners. Grace danced with her children, with Marcus, with Oliver bouncing in her arms. She danced like a woman who had been freed from chains she had worn for 30 years, because she had been the legacy. 5 years later, Grace Mbeki Wellington stood at a podium before the United Nations. She had been invited to address the General Assembly on the topic of modern slavery. Her speech had been translated into 6 languages and was being broadcast live to an audience of millions. "I stand before you today," Grace began, "not as a victim, but as a survivor. Not as a symbol, but as a person. Not as a statistic, but as a mother, a wife, a grandmother, and a friend." She looked out at the sea of faces, diplomats, leaders, changemakers from every corner of the globe. 25 million people are currently trapped in forced labor worldwide. 25 million human beings who are being bought and sold, used and discarded, erased and forgotten. "I know what that feels like, because I was one of them." Her voice grew stronger. "But I also know that freedom is possible. I know that even the deepest darkness can be penetrated by light. I know that the human spirit, when it refuses to be broken, cannot be defeated by any system of oppression." She told her story, the orphanage, the trafficking, the years of servitude. She told them about Oliver's crying in the night, about Marcus's accusation and his redemption, about the trial that had changed everything. And then she told them what it all meant. Every person in chains is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope for the future. When we fail to see their humanity, we lose a piece of our own. When we turn away from their suffering, we diminish ourselves. Grace raised her hand, and on her finger glittered the diamond from her family's mine. This ring was cut from a stone that should have been my birthright. It was stolen from my family, used to build fortunes for people who never questioned where their wealth came from. For decades, it symbolized everything that was taken from me. She lowered her hand to her heart. Now, it symbolizes something else. It symbolizes reclamation, resurrection. The power of one person's story to change the course of history. She looked directly into the cameras. I am asking each of you to look at the people in your lives who are invisible. The domestic workers in your homes. The laborers who made your clothes and grew your food. The vulnerable people in your communities who have no voice and no power. Look at them. Really look. And then ask yourself, what am I going to do about it? The applause that followed was deafening, but Grace didn't hear it. She was looking at the front row, where Marcus sat with Oliver now, 7 years old, and growing into a thoughtful, compassionate young man, and her grandchildren, and her children, and everyone she loved. Her family, her legacy, her reason. That night, back home in Connecticut, Grace tucked Oliver into bed. He was too old for lullabies now, but he still liked when Gigi sat with him until he fell asleep. It was their tradition, the same tradition that had started when she was just the help and he was just a crying baby who needed someone to stay. Gigi? Oliver asked, his eyes already heavy. Yes, my love? Why do you always stay with me? You're tired too. You could go to sleep. Grace smiled and ran her fingers through his hair, his father's hair, his mother's eyes, a beautiful blend of everything good. Do you know what the most precious thing in the world is? She asked. Oliver shook his head. It's the chance to give what you never received. When I was little, I cried in the dark, and no one came. So now, when you need someone in the dark, I come. That's how we heal the world. Oliver, one small act of love at a time. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, just as he had when he was a baby. I love you, Gigi. I love you too, my darling. More than all the diamonds, in all the mines, in all the world. Oliver's eyes closed. His breathing slowed. And Grace Mbeki Wellington, maid, queen, survivor, mother, sat in the darkness and kept watch over the child who had saved her life by needing her to save his. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere in the world, someone was still crying in the dark, waiting for rescue. But because of Grace, there were now thousands of people who had learned to listen for those cries. Thousands of hands ready to reach out. Thousands of voices ready to say, I see you. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. And that, in the end, was the real fortune she had reclaimed. Not money, not status, not even justice. Love, the only wealth that truly matters.